In this lecture, we will learn how to work with variables in GitLab CI. So here we have this pipeline with these 4 stages. So we have added the Docker stage. In the Docker stage, here we have 3 jobs. First of all, the Docker build job. Here we want to simulate building the Docker image. So I give the image this tag. So first of all, here is my Docker username, and then the image name, and then the version. Okay, so here we will simulate building the Docker image. And then in the Docker test job, here we will test the Docker image by simulating creating a container using the Docker run command. And then in the Docker push job, we will push the image to Docker Hub. So first of all, in the before script section, I simulate logging in to Docker Hub using the Docker login command. And then here in the script section, we simulate pushing the Docker image. Okay. So here we notice that we are hard coding the same values in the 3 Docker jobs. I have hard coded the username, the image name, and the version in the 3 Docker job, in the Docker build job, the Docker test job, and the Docker push job. Here, instead of hard coding the same values in different places, it is better to store them using variables, and then you access the values using the created variables. Here, if we go to the documentation of GitLab CI, so this section talks about GitLab CI CD Variables. Here, if we go to the bottom, we find that we can define variables either in a job. When we define variables in a job, these variables will be available only for this job. Okay. So for example, here in the Docker build job, we can define variables using the variables keyword. Here we can define, for example, the Docker username. So here I want to store my Docker username. We'll define also the image name. To store the name that we want to give to the Docker image. And finally, the image version. To store the version of the Docker image. And now these variables can be accessed either in the main script of the job or in the before script or after script sections. So for example, here we will access the Docker username. To fetch the value from the variable, we start with a $sign followed by the name of the variable, which is here Docker username. The same for the image name. So we start with a $sign followed by the variable name, which is image name. And finally, we will access the image version. So as we said previously, these variables are only accessible in this job. So we cannot access them, for example, in the Docker test job or in any other job. To make these variables accessible for all the jobs, we have to define them at the global level, okay? At the workflow level, okay? So here in the documentation of GitLab CI, it says here that we can define variables either in a job. So these variables will be available only in this job, and they can be accessed in the script or before script or after script sections of this job, or we can define them at the global level of the pipeline. So we make them available for all the jobs of the pipeline. So here, to make these variables available for all the jobs, we have to define them at the top level. So we have to define them at the global level. So let's define them at the global level of the workflow, because we will need these variables also in the Docker test job and in the Docker push job. So it is better here to define these variables at the global level. So now these variables can be accessed from all the jobs. So now in the Docker test job, instead of using these values, we will fetch the values that we have defined in these variables. So we start by the Docker username, then the Docker image name, and finally the image version. And the same for the Docker push job. So here also for the username, we will use the Docker username variable. Here we have also the password. We can define the password at the global level, but here we need the password only in the Docker push job, okay? We didn't need the password in any other job. So here we can define the password in the Docker push job, okay? So here after defining the stage, we will use the variables keyword and we will define a variable. We will call it Docker password for storing the password for logging into Docker Hub. And here instead of this value, we will fetch the value defined in the Docker password variable. Another thing that we have to know here about variables is that if we define a variable with the same name at the global level and at the job level, the variable of the job level will take higher precedence, okay? For example, here we have defined the image name here at the global level. If we define a variable here in the Docker push job with the same name, so here we will define a variable with the same name, which is image name. But we will give this variable a different value, okay? So here we have given this value, which is web app. Here we will give another value, for example, web app 2. So here, because we have defined a variable with the same name at the global level and at the job level, the variable at the job level will take higher precedence. So for example, if we trigger the pipeline with this configuration, for the image name, the value that will be used in the Docker push job is web app 2 and not web app, okay? That's because the variable defined at the job level will take higher precedence, okay? So let's remove this variable and commit the changes. So now the pipeline was triggered. So here we have 4 stages with 6 jobs. So let's see the execution of the Docker build job. So here is the execution of the Docker build job. So here when executing the echo command, we access the value stored in the Docker username variable and the image name variable. But here we didn't see the image version because the variable that we have defined is image version and not version. So if we go to the pipeline editor, here we have defined the image version variable. But here when executing the echo command, we have accessed the version variable which is not defined. So the name of the variable is image version. The same for the Docker test job and the Docker push job. So let's commit the changes and see the execution of the pipeline. So now the pipeline was triggered. So let's see now the execution of the Docker build job. So now when executing the echo command, we have accessed the values stored in the three variables, okay? We have accessed the Docker username, the image name, and the image version. So let's move now to the Docker test job. So here is the execution of the main script of the Docker test job. So here, when we execute the echo command, we have accessed the values stored in these variables, okay? The Docker username variable, the image name variable, and the image version. The same for the Docker push job. So the Docker push job starts first of all by executing this command, the echo command, to simulate logging into Docker Hub. So here we get the value stored in the Docker username, and we get also the password which is stored at the job level, okay? So here, if we go to the pipeline editor, so the Docker push job gets the value stored in the Docker username, which is defined at the global level, and it gets also the password stored in the Docker password variable defined here at the job level, okay? And then it moves to the execution of the main script when we simulate pushing the Docker image to Docker Hub by executing the Docker push command. So here we get the values as stored in the Docker username, in the image name, and in the image version variables. So here for the password, it will be available for anyone who has access to this repository, okay? In the next lecture, we will learn how to mask sensitive data like passwords in GitLab CI.